Greeting YouTube. So I found myself thinking about languages the other day, specifically languages in like a high fantasy game like Pathfinder or D&D. I don't think I've talked about this topic before. I actually did a search for my own videos for the word language under RPG in my RPG folder. Didn't find anything. So if I've covered this already, I apologize. I've made lots of videos. Um, and I find that the high fantasy model in those two games to me is both restrictive and too complex. What do I mean by that? Well, the humans have the same plethora of languages as you would find in any human culture. So you got people living in different parts of the world, and they've all got their own languages, as well as dead languages that are no longer extant, things like that. Whereas all the other species have dwarven, elven, with dialects that might be like high elven or uh, rural elven or sylvan elven or sea elven or something like that. But it's each species has like its blanket tongue: halfling, gnome, orc, goblin, stuff like that. But while the humans have got dozens of languages, and that's always bugged me. So I've been thinking that from my mind there's really two ways of going. One which is to toss out the current style and go with something new, and the other is to lean into it even harder. So let's think about the first model first. The first suggestion, the former first. Let's put it that way. Let's do away with species languages completely, and we go with just cultural, social, and religious. Now, this is already more complex than most high fantasy games have. So, like cultural, it's like French is they speak French, whereas there could still be societal groups within France that speak a dialect that is significantly different from French, or it's because of an immigrant group moved in and they've been there so long that their tongue is now kind of its own unique thing. And of course, then there's religious. Now, for a lot of people, religious and cultural languages are going to be the same. In the U.S., people read a Bible that is written in English. Though I believe that there are some people in the world that prefer to hear Mass in Latin. I hope they can speak Latin. Otherwise, it's just pretty sounding words. Um, And that way, it doesn't matter what species you are, it depends where you live and your social standing. So if you are the posh folks in London, you speak a much different form of English than the people living in community housing. You know what I mean? They're not speaking the same language as the nobility is. Or you like get some of like Northern Ireland, some of the accents and dialects are significantly different from standard English, to the point, or I've actually watched interviews with people whose accent was so heavy they had to put in subtitles, even though we were all speaking the same language. Hi, Dwight. That's Dwight in the wait in the background. Um, and that way, it's a much richer way of doing things, and you would still have languages that would be associated with species. So, for example, under the mountains in the great dwarven, citadels deep in the earth where they're in the Underdark, their language, whatever it's called, is associated with dwarves, even though it isn't necessarily a dwarven specific language. It's just the one that they took with them to down when they were down there. It's the one they've always spoken. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's the only place it's spoken, because it isn't. It's just the most common language in that area. And if you were to be raised there and you never leave, the under the mountain, you may never really be exposed to any other languages than that one. I was very pleased to find out that the common tongue in Galarian, Pathfinder world, actually has a name. It's called Teldane, which is a really cool word. And I love the fact that the language has a name. So instead of calling it common, which I think is kind of lame, Teldane's a much cooler thing. And so people speak Teldane because it's a mishmash language. It's polyglottal. It's a trade tongue. It may only have like, 3 or 4 thousand words in it, really. It's really about finding things that you need on a daily basis. It's about trade. It's about the kind of thing if you're a soldier going from place to place or a sailor going from place to place, this lets you find housing and food and brothels and drink and drugs and a doctor and all the kind of things that you're going to need when you're in port or you're in a capital or something. But it's not the kind of thing that you're going to be discussing philosophy with. Okay, you're not going to be arguing a high level religious doctrine in this language. So I like the idea of Teldane being the trade tongue, and some people may refer to it as that. Some people may not even know that the language has a name. Um, for example, there are some people, if you say Homo sapien to them, they won't necessarily know that that means us because they just don't have that background that included that information. Um, and I think that's much more fascinating. That way you have dwarves that are living in places far from home. They've lived there for generations. And some of them may still speak, some of the hardcore ones may still speak the language of under the mountain. But the most of the folks are just speaking whatever language within the city they're in, the most common language or languages. And of course they speak Teldane because they're business people, and that's what most dwarves are of some variety or another, craftsmen, things like that. Now, the latter idea of leaning harder into the current high fantasy model is you do away with all human languages except for one. Human. Each species has their own language, or bunches of species use the same, like in the case of goblins, there's multiple species that use goblin, there's multiple species that speak giant, for example. Um, but that's it. You, this is the language you speak because the gods have decided this is what you speak. And you'd still have a trade tongue, probably just referred to as trade tongue, because you don't need the fancy word Teldane in this particular model. So the trade tongue is spoken by, again, it's the thing you need to if you're an adventurer. It's the thing, pardon me, it's the thing you need if you're a traveler. But again, it's not the kind of thing you do for nuance. You're not going to be wooing someone to get a date successfully with that unless they find it charming that you're being somewhat clumsy and ill-spoken because you're trying to use a language that was never intended for seduction. um, so I think that those two models are really quite useful now. I believe, if I remember correctly, in the Dragon Star setting, which was kind of Starfinder before Starfinder was a thing, um, the gods had just decided that each species speaks that language that they know, human, dwarf, what have you. I think they called it common because they didn't break from the model. They didn't make it similar across the board like I'm trying to do. And it's the same everywhere. Even if they were to call the language something else, it's still the same language. Every dwarf speaks the same thing no matter where you are in the Dragon Star, you know, star systems. And every elf speaks elf, every gnome speaks gnome. You get the point. Um, just because that's what the gods ordained. They decide this is what's going to happen. That's what happens. It was also sorry about that. It was also a nice system that had a pantheon of 12 gods. Many people called them different things, but each had a specific role. There was there was the craftsman, there was the mother, and there was there was death, and each specific archetypes. And lots of people called that each archetype by different names, but they were still the same archetype, and they were still had the same, divine portfolio, if you will, just called by different names by different peoples and different cultures. Uh, Perchance even like the same, but different names by the same culture over a long enough span of time. So which model do you prefer for languages and which model do you use, or do you just not worry about it? Is language something you just don't concern yourself with? Because if you're using the first model I showed you, having a literacy skill is very important because not only does it mean you learn more languages, and that's going to be very important in a world that's going to have a lot of languages, but it means that you're going to be able to use your literacy skill to be able to pick up dialects because whatever language is being spoken by the folks in the place where the language developed is going to be different than the same language spoken by in their colony that's been separated from the motherland for 300 years. Just like Quebecois French is different than Parisian French, and it's different from the French spoken in Africa. There are distinct differences. I know I was talking to at one point I was talking to some folks that I used to work with, And at one time, we had people from 6 different countries that spoke Spanish, and they all said that the accents were different. And for example, the folks from Dominica spoke incredibly fast to the point where a lot of the other Spanish speakers they couldn't figure out what the hell they were saying either. They were speaking so rapidly. Um, so let's talk about language. How have you used it? How have you made things unique in your game? Uh, and do you find just using the bog standard out of the off the books thing useful, or do you want something unique? Bye, bye.